Good evening, tributes. Welcome back to Tales of the Hunger Games. I hope you're all well. And before we begin this week, I'm going to talk about last week's games. Now, I know that lots of people had issues with the outcome of these games, and I can see why, but I had to look at this as realistically as I could. And if the Capitol restarted the games, they would do anything to put these victors back into the games. And do remember that this is written from the Capitol's point of view, so when it says that Peter and Katniss were both given a choice, do you really think it was as fair as the other victor's choice? I'll just leave that there with you. And if they were in the arena, do you think there is any universe where the Capitol would let them survive again? I don't see it myself, but I won't lie that I do maybe regret killing them off. However, we all make mistakes, and I openly admit that I've made lots in my life, and even when making this series as well. Other things in this series I regret, for example, are not making the earlier games longer, and not using a different name for the tributes from the 75th games. Lots of them I use the actors' names. I would have liked to actually if I'd used a different first name for each of them, but we try and learn from our mistakes, and I do like to listen to all of you, and your support means a lot. And I look forward to carrying on with this new chapter of Panem with all of you. And so without further ado, let's go. District 11 had always been one of the poorer districts, but it suffered even further during the Reclamation, with many of its population needing to be detained and killed for their harmful and rebellious behaviour towards their own district's buildings and even guards of the capital. Geranio Landry had always seemed like a cheerful and studious young man, who had often been at the top of his class, whilst he enjoyed a strong relationship with his parents, maybe aided by the fact that he was an only child. However, the previous year, the Capitol had no other option than to detain his parents in holding cells away from District 11, due to their involvement in ongoing protests against Capitol rule. This led Geranio to enter a deep depression over the following months, which even caused his girlfriend, Lily, to leave him. Being 17, he was no longer required to be in school, and so he spent most of his days prior to these games alone in his family's hut, or working in the fruit fields if he was running low on money. Lavender LeBlanc lived on the opposite side of the district, in one of the most deprived areas of her zone, known as the Wetlands. Despite being only 15 years of age, and from an area known for its high levels of unemployment and squalor, Lavender had managed to bring some income to her family by collecting supplies from the fields and using them to distill her own liquor. Lavender often sold this liquor to the locals of the Wetlands, and even various peacekeepers within the districts, who allegedly came back for more due to the low level of side effects the morning after. Being the oldest of 7 children, she had all but abandoned her studies, and chose to divert her extra time and effort into her growing business, which allegedly made her enough money to at least support her mother and siblings. On the 4th of July, the reaping occurred as normal, with the youths of District 11 wearing clothes of the green colour that was now used to represent their district following the Reclamation. As part of another new tradition, the reigning victor, Ennius Dalton, was tasked with picking the names from the reaping bowls in each district's reaping. It was seen earlier that day that he had taken great amusement in picking the 2 tributes from District 12, and he was clearly pleased to be performing another reaping. Once Mayor Bayou had finished his opening speech, Ennius picked a name from the bowl for the female tributes, and he announced that he had chosen Lavender LeBlanc. When the camera found her in the middle of her zone's enclosure, she stood there aghast, wearing a simple lime dress that it later turned out had belonged to her mother. Although Lavender was quite sad, the reaction of certain members of the surrounding crowd was much stronger, with a bunch of wetland hooligans screaming abuse at Ennius from the back, which forced 2 peacekeepers to threaten these savages with their guns, and hence allow the proceedings to continue. Lavender was then escorted to the platform and shook hands with Ennius, and despite being known as a confident, feisty young lady, she appeared rather intimidated by his firm clutch on her hand. After this, Ennius picked a name for the male tribute, and a 17-year-old named Rake Romero was chosen. The loudest reaction was that of Rake's girlfriend, Time, who wailed loudly and almost collapsed. Rake let out a breath of frustration and sorrow, but just as Ennius called for him to hurry up and make his way to the platform, Geranio quickly shouted out to volunteer himself. There were many murmurs throughout the crowd, and even Ennius appeared to be surprised, but Geranio calmly repeated that he was volunteering, and made his way to the platform, whilst Rake breathed a large sigh of relief. As Ennius shook Geranio's hand, he was heard to be congratulating Geranio for his courage, but as he examined Geranio's moth-bitten suit, that now appeared to be more black than the traditional green, he subtly recoiled. Lavender and Geranio shook hands with each other, and Ennius demanded applause from the crowd, who still seemed shocked at witnessing someone from their district volunteer. A meagre applause was eventually attained from the rather feeble population, and Ennius was quickly whisked off in his private hovercraft to District 10 for the next reaping. Whilst being held in the town hall, Lavender was visited by her mother and siblings, one of whom was allegedly struck by a peacekeeper for pretending to play with his gun. Although Lavender's mother seemed distraught to say goodbye to her daughter, Lavender rushed past any sentimental goodbyes and instead told her mother and elder siblings as quickly and thoroughly as she could about how they could distill liquor, presumably so they would still have a chance of continuing her business and having a source of income. As for Geranio, he was not visited by anyone, and he patiently waited in an apparent daze for the train to be ready for them. Once the tributes were on the train, Lavender tried exchanging a few pleasantries with Geranio, but it was almost impossible for her to move the conversation along, and Geranio retreated to his own carriage shortly afterwards. After being left alone, Lavender asked one of the guards if she and Geranio would have a mentor, and she was told that they would meet their mentor once they arrived in the capital. For the rest of the journey, Lavender examined the furnishings of the dining carriage, and was apparently in awe at the fine designs. It was later discovered that she had caused a distraction towards the end of the journey, which allowed her to steal some of the silver. When the pair arrived in the capital that evening, they rested in their apartment for a brief time, before a guard came to tell them that they were being taken to meet their mentor. The pair appeared slightly confused, as they later revealed that they had expected their mentor to come to their apartment, but they took the lift down to the lobby and were quickly placed into a limousine. The guards later reported that the sheer size of the vehicle had made Lavender gasp in awe. Although Geranio tried asking on several occasions where they were being taken, the driver gave them no answer, but even 10 minutes later, when they passed a sign for the Jansen Mansions and Studio Complex, they still appeared to be none the wiser. Bluebell Jansen, now Creed, was allegedly furious about having to mentor tributes again, apparently stating that she had no decent advice for them, and that, at 85 years old, the days of using her legs as weapons were long behind her. When Geranio and Lavender were escorted to the grand hall of the Creed mansion, they were left speechless by the grand size and sophisticated architecture of the building. After waiting for several minutes, 2 of Bluebell's grandchildren, Claudius and Ivona, dismissed the guards and escorted the tributes to the room where Bluebell was expecting them. Ivona stated in a later interview that she was able to get some conversation from Lavender about how the journey had been, but it was almost impossible to get anything from Geranio, although she said that she had thought he was redeemably pretty. Bluebell then met the tributes, and they seemed to share bemused looks with each other about why a lady of such an advanced age was their mentor. Bluebell quickly predicted what they were thinking, and told them that she was the only remaining victor from District 11, to which Geranio finally spoke properly, replying that he thought all the past victors had been killed. However, Bluebell snapped back that if people like you, they're more likely to protect you, before giving a knowing wink to Lavender. She then stated that she was hungry, and was going down to have dinner with her family, but ordered one of the AVOXes to show Geranio and Lavender the hour-long highlights of the 21st Hunger Games, which she had won 68 years before. As they watched the unfolding action, it was clear that they were in shock at not only how Bluebell won, but also how she had so easily manipulated her opponents. The pair also appeared quite puzzled by the proceedings of the games themselves, and it later emerged that neither of them had ever seen any games apart from last year's. Furthermore, when Bluebell killed her district partner, Quagmire, Lavender looked aghast, and asked if they were allowed to do that in the arena, to which Geranio responded that there appeared to be no rules. Halfway through the viewing, the remains of the family's meal, along with a bottle of red wine, were sent up for the tributes. Lavender surprisingly stated that she had lost her appetite, but she drank some of the wine, whilst Geranio finished all the food within a few minutes. As the last of the highlights were shown, Lavender appeared to have become quite inebriated by the wine, and she tried convincing Geranio to have some as well. When Geranio refused, Lavender told him to live a little and enjoy himself, but just as he was about to refuse once more, Bluebell made Geranio jump by appearing next to his chair and stating that while she sent up only one bottle for a reason, Lavender was at least correct about enjoying oneself. Bluebell reiterated that they needed to at least look like they were enjoying themselves, so that people would be more likely to enjoy their presence, which would in turn be more likely to lead to sponsorship and allies within the arena. She told them that she would make sure her grandson, Claudius, was assigned to be their designer, and that she would do whatever she could to get the pair decent sponsors if they lived long enough. However, she then stated that the rest was up to them, before bidding them farewell and asking the guards to escort them back down to the limousine. During the ride home, Geranio finally opened up to Lavender about what they had seen that evening, and he asked if she also found it strange that someone could apparently revel in the success of killing other people. However, Lavender responded that Bluebell used a strategy that had worked best for her, and that if either of them won this year's games, they could choose how they would celebrate their victory. The following night, the parade took place in the Avenue of the Tributes. Claudius Creed dressed Geranio and Lavender in basic undergarments that were covered by an array of light brown and beige vines that were intermingled with lemons and limes. Claudius seemed to plan each fruit's position with meticulous precision. At the last minute, he inserted small pieces of lemon through Geranio's dark braids, and small pieces of lime within Lavender's blonde ringlets, and although Geranio allegedly looked like he wanted to scream, Bluebell told them how divine they both looked in these outfits, before reminding them to smile and wave as much as they could. As the chariot was about to leave, Claudius told the pair how splendificent they were. Just as Geranio looked back and asked what this word meant, their carriage pulled forwards, and Lavender quickly grabbed his hand as they came into view of the audience on either side. Although Geranio looked extremely dazed and out of place, Lavender raised his hand with hers and appeared to remind him to smile. Geranio proceeded to force a grin as they made their way down the parade to a barrage of cheers and flowers. Their outfits were well received, and despite missing out on Anderson Fashion's Best Dressed, to the tributes from District 5, who were dressed as sparkly wind turbines, Lavender in particular impressed the capital with what some described as a feisty grin. The next day, training commenced, and Geranio tried practicing with the throwing knives. Although he had some experience with weaponry, he was not as skilled as the other tributes, with Natalia and Ciro, both from 2, practicing either side of him at the same station, and thereby intimidating him. However, he took the knives and threw them at the targets for the spear station, whenever it was empty, and as the day went by, his aim proceeded to improve. Lavender, on the other hand, spent most of the day in the plant station, where she reviewed her knowledge of various plants, many of which she had used to distill the liquor, but she also appeared quite intimidated by many other tributes using weapons around her, and so she stayed in the plant station instead. On the second day, Geranio tried to use the spears, but with a limited amount of success. When Dynamo and Titania, both from 1, practiced at the same station, Geranio appeared shocked when Dynamo pushed Titania into the stand full of spears. Although there was a loud clanging of spears as the stand fell over and Titania cut her hand, Dynamo simply claimed that this was a joke. Geranio then snuck off to practice some survival skills, whilst Dynamo was being reprimanded by the training staff, with Donald Crane even slapping him across the face for his actions. Lavender spent most of the day in the survival station with Nevada, from 6, who spent most of the day looking faint and shaking, possibly due to morphling withdrawal, although this is heavily debated by some. Lavender noticed that Blue and Nasuta, both from 4, were practicing their fishing expertise in the aquatic station, and she asked them if she could show them her skills with plant identification, in exchange for them showing her how to fish. But Blue scoffed at this proposal, and Nasuta flatly refused. Meanwhile, John, from 12, who had been watching Geranio practice, tried asking Geranio for an alliance, stating that he would make a better ally to him than Lavender would, especially seeing as he was adept at stitching wounds back together, which would be a useful skill in any arena. However, in a surprise show of loyalty, Geranio stated that if he was going to ally with anyone in the room, it would be Lavender, and so John went back to practicing with his bow and arrow. When the assessment took place the next day, Geranio threw some knives with a certain degree of accuracy, which gave him a respectable score of 7, whilst Lavender showed an almost perfect knowledge of the 800 different plants that could be featured in an arena, which saw her walk out with a score of 6. The highest scorers were Dynamo, Ciro, and Tef from 9, who each scored 10, whilst Lampa from 3 and Luma from 8 each scored 8. The lowest scores of the group were shared by Nevada and Martella from 10, who each scored just 3. Geranio's odds of victory were set at 10-1, while Lavender's was slightly higher, at 13-1. The interviews took place the following evening, and when Eugenia Ravenstill walked onto the stage, she was greeted by triumphant applause, with many of the crowd also marvelling at her golden dress, which was an appropriate way to pay homage to District 2's victory, and the dress also managed to complement the gold tints that ran through her curls. The interviews ran upwards through the district numbers, with Ciro and Natalia's confidence immediately making them stand out amongst this year's lineup. The youngest tribute, Hertz, from 5, at first amused the crowd by continually talking over Eugenia and laughing, but this quickly appeared to annoy her, and the joke soon wore off, which led the boy to be jeered as he walked off the stage. Tef was mainly admired by the audience for his good looks and muscular arms that were perfectly framed into his beige shirt. Furthermore, his odds improved significantly after he spoke about the various ways that he could kill someone with a pitchfork. Lavender's interview started with Eugenia complimenting her on the emerald gown and gloves that Claudius had designed for her. A few light-hearted questions went by, and Eugenia asked Lavender what she could do to survive the games, to which she responded that she was resourceful, before mentioning her liquor business back home, which did indeed appear to impress the audience. Lavender even amused them further by stating that if she won, she would give a free bottle to every house in Panem. Even though most people knew that she was probably joking, her plucky humour made her interview undoubtedly the best received from the outlying districts. Immediately following Lavender was Geranio. He once again seemed quiet and thoughtful, which was a strange juxtaposition to his sparkly lime suit and finely plaited braids. After a few jokes, Eugenia asked Geranio what all of Panem was wondering, which was why he had volunteered. With almost no expression, Geranio breathed in and out slowly, which left the audience in silent suspense, before tears welled up in his eyes, and after a few moments he told Eugenia that he had planned to kill himself if he had not been reaped. A few shocked gasps were heard, before the silence resumed, and in a sudden change of composure, Eugenia asked Geranio, who had now had tears streaming down his face, why he had no longer wanted to live. Geranio took a few seconds to gather himself, before telling Eugenia and the audience that he no longer had his girlfriend, his parents, his studies, or anything left that made his life worth living. However, when the reaping occurred, he realized that he could take the place of whoever was reaped and stop them from having to die. As he struggled through his last sentence, the audience made a sympathetic sound of approval to what he had just said. When Geranio finished his explanation, Eugenia put her arm on his shoulder and told him that it was indeed very brave of him to volunteer under any circumstances, which mustered some applause from the audience. She then wisely pointed out that if Geranio went on to win this year's games, he would be able to have anything that made him happy, which triggered more cheers and applause. When the applause finally died down, Eugenia playfully ran her hand through her hair in a seductive manner and said, "You could even give me a go," which started the audience's laughter all over again. Tears were still present in Geranio's eyes, but after this dark admission, it did indeed seem like a weight had been lifted from his shoulders, and that he was now in lighter spirits. Eugenia concluded the interview, and Geranio received rapturous applause before leaving the stage. The final person to be interviewed was the game maker, Penelope Paddock, who deservedly received a standing ovation from the audience as she strutted out to Eugenia. Like the game makers before her, Penelope stayed quiet when she was asked about the upcoming arena, but she did mention that it was one of the most beautiful that she had seen so far, which triggered curious sounds from the audience, along with pensive expressions from the tributes, who were stood at the back of the stage. Shortly before noon the next day, the tributes were placed in their holding rooms, in order to wait for the games to begin, and they were all ordered to get changed into the dark green lycra suits and black aquatic trainers that had been provided. Just after Lavender had got into her suit, Bluebell came by to speak to her, and she told Lavender that it looked very nice on her. Lavender said that it was a bit of a squeeze, but Bluebell joked that this was not a problem, to which Lavender retorted that Bluebell of all people would know about that. They both laughed, and Bluebell embraced Lavender, before wishing her luck and continuing along the corridor to Geranio's room. As Bluebell entered Geranio's room, he was breathing deeply and appearing to be in deep concentration, but before he could say a word, Bluebell immediately told him how brave he had been, not just for volunteering, but also for being honest about his troubles the night before. She reminded him that in the past the capital liked displays of courage, which he had indeed shown. Bluebell told Geranio that he should try to ally with Lavender, as they were each other's best source of protection. Before Geranio could say anything, Bluebell kissed him on the cheek and winked at him before walking off. As she stood by the door, she told him that green was definitely his colour, before grinning and closing the door. All the tributes were then ordered into their tubes, and once the countdown ended, their tubes proceeded to rise into the arena. This year's games took place in tropical mountains. The arena was indeed judged by many capital citizens to be one of the most breathtaking so far, with deep blue skies and seas above and below the large, steep mountains that formed the perimeter of the arena. The games began at the bottom of the valley, with the podiums facing the cornucopia itself, which lay at the bottom of this hill, directly next to a drop that overlooked the sea. Scattered throughout the arena were a plethora of coconut trees, heaps of foliage, and mountainous alcoves, whilst the top of the valley was mainly composed of fruit trees and jagged rocks that led into the highest mountains. For this arena, Game Maker Paddock decided to include more weapons than anything else, and therefore the only supplies present in the cornucopia were a scattering of small bread loaves and empty bottles, a few boxes of matches, and a handful of blankets. Although the only weapons present were small knives, there were a total of 24 of them, which in theory could mean that each tribute would have access to one. As the countdown progressed, most tributes seemed slightly surprised by the lack of supplies, and this caused many of them to eye each other with more suspicion as to who was going to pursue which of the few supplies that were present. Lavender's podium was on the far right, with only Lincoln from 6 standing next to her. However, Geranio stood on a relatively central podium, with Nasuta from 4 on his left, and Tef from 9 on his right. Lavender tried to make eye contact with Geranio as the countdown passed through 20 seconds, but he was distracted by the events to his left, where Hertz from 5 was in the process of taking off one of his trainers while sporting a mischievous grin. Practically all the other tributes were staring at Hertz with perplexed expressions, and Ciro from 2 and Nevada from 6, who were either side of him, urged him to put his trainer back on, but he ignored their pleas. With just 10 seconds left, Hertz looked ready to throw his trainer next to the podium of Ciro, and even some of the other tributes were shouting at him to put it back down, but he then pulled his arm back to throw his trainer at Ciro. A loud explosion was heard, and many tributes impulsively closed their eyes, while Ciro and Nevada were splattered in Hertz's blood. Seeing what Hertz was about to attempt, Game Maker Paddock had wisely ordered for his tracker to be detonated, which left him collapsed on the ground in front of his podium, missing one of his arms and screaming out in pain. But the mines surrounding his podium had been turned off, in order to avoid more chaos before the games had even begun. Most other tributes then glanced back to the cornucopia just as the gong sounded. Like almost all the tributes, Geranio and Lavender immediately ran towards the cornucopia, whilst Hertz continued to scream on the ground. Geranio almost ran into Tef, who was subsequently tripped by Natalia from 2 before she kicked him in the groin. Geranio sprinted onwards to the cornucopia, whilst Natalia gouged Tef's eyes. As he continued, he ran straight past Ciro, who had already acquired a knife and was now repeatedly stabbing the girl from 9. Fortunately for Geranio, the knife that was taken by her had fallen just behind where Ciro was knelt, and so Geranio grabbed it and quickly looked around for Lavender, but he was alarmed to see that she was in trouble. Whilst Geranio was running for the knife, Lavender had picked up 2 loaves and an empty bottle, but just as she rushed for a blanket, she was hit in the arm by a knife thrown by Lincoln, and he tackled her to the ground. This made Lavender scream in pain and terror, and Lincoln pulled the knife out of her arm, which he tried to push into her throat, and she was holding his arm back with all the strength that she had. However, just as Lincoln was about to cut into Lavender's throat, Geranio forced his knife into the back of Lincoln's brain. Lincoln did not appear to initially realize what had happened, but as he swiped around to hit Geranio, he fell over to one side and seemed unable to get back up. Geranio then kicked him away and helped up Lavender, although before leaving the clearing, she quickly gathered the loaves and Geranio picked up the water bottle. She spotted a blanket just meters behind them, and she shouted that they should grab it. But when they looked back and saw Natalia pushing the girl from 5 over the drop behind the cornucopia, and the girl from 12 bleeding from her mouth and neck whilst crawling towards them, Geranio grabbed Lavender by the arm and practically forced her up the hill away from the cornucopia. Over the next few minutes, several other tributes continued running in the same direction as Geranio and Lavender, but due to the slopes and crevices of the valley, along with its width, these fleeing tributes were hardly able to see each other, let alone be close enough to fight each other. Geranio and Lavender proceeded to march up the hill, through uneven foliage and battered coconut trees. After about half an hour of walking and reaching 2/3 of the valley's height, 6 cannons were heard, and Lavender insisted that they stop for a break. She asked where they might be able to find water, correctly guessing that the bottles were empty for a reason. Whilst Geranio looked down the hill to see a group of tributes by the beach, trying to catch fish. Viewers had seen that shortly after the bloodbath, Ciro and Natalia noticed that fish may be one of the few sources of food in this area, and so they quickly found Blue and Nasuta, both from 4, before asking them to form an alliance. Lavender continued to lie on the ground, already exhausted from the hot sun, but as Geranio walked back to where she was resting, he seemed alarmed to hear voices just down the hill from them and approaching their position. Geranio rapidly forced Lavender to her feet and told her to hide. He then ran into one of the crannies at the base of the mountain and crouched down, whereas Lavender crawled behind some shrubs and covered her head with foliage. Over the next minute, Dynamo and Titania, both from 1, walked past and they spent some time discussing what they could see. But when a cannon suddenly sounded, they eventually continued up the hill. It was revealed to viewers that this cannon belonged to Lampa from 3 when she was found by John from 12, who chased her and then stabbed her to death. After a few minutes, Geranio and Lavender finally came out of their hiding places, and Lavender said that this location had just proved to be a decent place to stay, where they could hide and sleep that night, and so she suggested that they set base in this area for the evening, which Geranio agreed to. They proceeded to rest for a while, and Lavender appeared to be feeling the effects of thirst, so she and Geranio made their way across the hill, where they found a coconut tree in the middle of the valley. As they walked, Geranio continually looked at the blood on his shirt, and this appeared to distract him from what they were doing, but Lavender reminded him that they needed to hurry so they were not seen. When they reached the nearest tree, neither of them were able to climb it, and so Geranio asked Lavender to stand on his shoulders in order to reach the coconuts. Despite having trouble balancing and falling off Geranio's shoulders 3 times, Lavender was eventually able to pull one of the coconuts from the tree, and it smashed on impact with the ground. The pair quickly picked up the pieces of the coconut and poured its milk into the bottle, but they did not appear to realize that the sound of the collision had mustered some unwanted attention. A rather large and lanky monkey made its way up behind them and looked ready to attack. Luckily, Lavender saw it at the final moment, and as it was about to jump towards her, she picked up some of the coconut shell and instinctively held it out at the ready. The monkey then jumped at Lavender, but it collided headfirst with the heavy shell that she was holding, and it collapsed to the ground. Geranio then stabbed this monkey in the head, and Lavender seized the remains of the coconut before sprinting back to their base, whilst Geranio grabbed the monkey's body and ran after Lavender. When they arrived at their base again, Lavender was confused and asked Geranio why he had taken the monkey, to which he replied that its flesh might be edible. As dusk set in, 2 more cannons sounded just minutes apart, which were revealed to be the boy from 10 and then the girl from 8, when they were hunted down by Dynamo and Titania. The pair tried to set a fire as well, in order to cook the monkey's flesh, but without matches they had no success, and whilst discussing their strategy for the next day, they appeared to realize that their only sources of food were the bread and coconuts. Although the idea of fish from the sea was also discussed, Lavender pointed out that they should not dare to approach the beach whilst the tributes from Districts 2 and 4 were still there. That night, Lavender took the first watch, and as Geranio was about to sleep, the portraits of Lampa from 3, Hertz and the girl from 5, Lincoln from 6, the girl from 8, Teff and the girl from 9, the boy from 10, and the girl from 12 were shown. It was hard for the tributes without blankets to sleep, but most of them seemed too alert about the surrounding dangers to care about the cold. Halfway through the night, Lavender switched places with Geranio, and he kept watch until sunrise. As Geranio was showing signs of fatigue during the sunrise of the next morning, he and Lavender were abruptly awoken by the cannon of Nano from 3, when he succumbed to injuries caused by an extremely violent monkey the night before. After continuing to rest and take turns keeping watch until shortly after noon, Geranio told Lavender that he was going to try and get some more coconuts, but as he left, Lavender realized that he would need her help. She proceeded to follow him across the valley to the coconut tree from the day before, but she found him sitting near the tree with his head in his hands. As Lavender approached Geranio from behind, he quickly jolted round and bared his knife, before seeing that it was only Lavender, and he put his knife back. Lavender asked Geranio what he was doing, and he explained that he needed time to think about what he had done. Lavender seemed to take a few moments to realize that Geranio was talking about Lincoln, but she stated to Geranio that he had saved her life, to which he fired back that he had killed Lincoln in order to do this. Eugenia and Donald discussed this scene during the daily highlights that night, and Donald stated that it was not uncommon for tributes to feel this way after killing someone else. Geranio then asked Lavender in a rather accusatory manner about why she was being so nice to him, and she responded that if they worked together, then one of them was more likely to win, and that if one of them did win, they could spend the rest of their life helping their family, their district, and even other people, thereby making amends for the killings that they had committed in order to be the victor. Lavender then got up and walked to the coconut tree, and after appearing to comprehend Lavender's argument, Geranio followed her. He once again tried to balance Lavender on his shoulders, but the pair's efforts did not go as planned, and Lavender fell to the ground, just as Furs and Wirral, both from 7, approached them from behind. Geranio immediately swung round and pointed his knife at Furs and Wirral, but Furs quickly stated that he and Wirral had a lot of experience with climbing trees, and that they would be willing to collect a coconut for Geranio and Lavender in exchange for some bread. Lavender in particular was quite taken aback by this offer, but after a few tense moments of silence, she looked at Geranio, who nodded in acceptance. Wirral scooted up the tree by using her knees and hands in a simultaneous manner. Once she reached the top, she started to rip the roots of the coconut from the tree, but just as it started to come loose and Geranio's attention was fixed on what she was doing, Lavender spotted Furs reaching into his pockets from the corner of her eye. Furs pulled out a knife and sprinted to Geranio, whilst Lavender shouted a warning, which gave Geranio enough time to jump out the way, but Furs proceeded to punch Geranio to the ground, and he held the knife over his neck, which Geranio tried desperately to push away. Whilst Wirral was trying to loosen another coconut in the tree above, Lavender attempted to push Furs off of Geranio, but he swiped the knife at her and this cut her leg, which made her fall backwards. As Furs pushed the knife back towards Geranio's neck, Wirral finally loosened the coconut, and she threw it directly at Geranio's head. However, Lavender, who seemed to have noticed what Wirral was trying to do, got in the way of the coconut and caught it, before smashing it down onto Furs's head, which immediately knocked him unconscious. As he fell to the ground, Geranio got out from underneath him, and Lavender smashed the coconut against Furs's head again and again until his cannon sounded. Meanwhile, Wirral used the distraction to jump from the tree and escape. Furs's cannon sounded, but shortly after the hovercraft approached and Geranio and Lavender turned their attention to Wirral, they heard the monkey screaming again from behind the nearest slope, followed by Wirral's own screaming and the boom of her cannon. As the bodies of these two tributes were collected, Geranio suggested that they left before the other tributes came to investigate, and they quickly gathered the coconuts. As they jogged back to their base, Geranio asked Lavender if she felt any guilt for having killed Furs just minutes earlier. She responded that she did feel somewhat guilty, but that it was either them or us. She went on to say that she had a family back home who relied on her, and Geranio quietly processed what she was saying. For the rest of the day, the duo remained in the area where they had slept the night before, and they later ate the coconuts and bread. They occasionally hid in the undergrowth when they thought they heard other tributes approaching, but unbeknownst to them, no tribute came within 500 meters of them over that day, with almost all the other tributes resting in the higher mountains or on the beach. As the darkness set in, Lavender and Geranio looked up at the stars and tried to count how many of them they could see, which Geranio suggested as a way to take their minds off the cold and the fact that they were in the arena, but as they looked up, they saw a sponsor gift fly down towards them. They were delighted to have been sent a blanket, and they quickly huddled together beneath it, although this quickly made them tired, and so Geranio agreed to take the first watch whilst Lavender slept, and shortly after she started to sleep, the portraits of Nano from 3 and Furs and Wirral, both from 7, were shown in the sky, which meant that only half of the tributes now remained. As Geranio and Lavender awoke the next morning, they drank some of the coconut milk, and then discussed if they should stay in the same location. Lavender initially wanted to stay, so that they could remain hidden from other tributes, but Geranio looked down to the beach and noticed that the tributes who had been there appeared to have gone. He argued that they should take advantage of their absence and head down to the beach whilst they could, but Lavender insisted that it was not worth the risk, although she eventually agreed. They spent approximately 20 minutes walking down the hill as quietly and diligently as possible, so that they could hear other tributes if they approached. This caution paid off when Lavender saw the tributes from Districts 2 and 4 walking up the hills at the other side of the valley, and she quickly forced Geranio into a nearby bush with her, which stopped them from being seen but caused amusement in Snow Square, as Lavender was now awkwardly positioned on top of Geranio in a very suggestive position, which left the pair trying not to react to this involuntary intimacy. Eventually, Lavender felt like it was safe, and she helped Geranio back up, but he stood still in shock as he gazed at the horizon. Lavender took just a few steps before looking at the horizon, and she saw a large tsunami making its way through the sea towards the valley. As Lavender stood speechless, Geranio grabbed her by the arm and forced her up the hill with him. Upon noticing the wave, they were stood at roughly a third of the height of the valley, and Donald explained that the height of the wave was estimated to reach approximately halfway up the valley. However, as they ran, Lavender tripped and appeared to hurt her left ankle. She screamed at Geranio for help, and as he looked back at Lavender, she panicked as the wave started to near the shore. But Geranio ran back and picked up Lavender before hoisting her onto his back. He proceeded to ascend the valley as quickly as he could with Lavender on his back, but this did indeed slow him down. As the wave washed over the beach and started making its way up through the valley, two cannons were heard, within approximately 10 seconds of each other, and despite now clearly being exhausted, Geranio continued to carry Lavender. The wave had started to slow down, but it was still making its way up the valley towards them at an intimidating speed. Lavender screamed as it came even nearer, and Geranio tried to speed up, but they were then hit by the first moisture of the wave. Geranio and Lavender were both pulled under the water's current, and the wave finally plateaued shortly after hitting them. Despite not being able to see them through the water, Eugenia said that there was no way they could survive being hit by the wave, but Donald told her to hold on, and that there was a victor from before the Second Rebellion who had survived after spending longer under the water from another wave. After nearly a minute had passed, Geranio and Lavender finally rose to the surface almost simultaneously, and they gasped out for air, with cheers sounding through Snow Square. The pair supported each other as they waded to the dry land just ahead of them, and when they reached an alcove next to one of the mountains, they quickly checked that no other tributes were around before collapsing in exhaustion. As they rested, Geranio joked that being from the wetlands, Lavender should be used to the water. She then looked at him with a confused look of amusement before stating that this was maybe the worst joke that she had ever heard, and Geranio let out a guilty grin. But Lavender subsequently thanked him for saving her again, and went on to say that if Geranio needed proof that his life was valuable, then this was it. As Geranio smiled back at Lavender, she embraced him. Yet in an apparent misinterpretation of her gratitude, Geranio pulled Lavender closer and tried to kiss her. However, she quickly pushed him back, whilst telling him that it wasn't right. This proceeded to cause laughter in Snow Square, but whilst Geranio looked embarrassed, Lavender told him that she certainly did not think he was unattractive, but she simply did not feel this way for him, although he could make someone else very happy in the future. As Geranio let out a weak smile and he drank some of the coconut milk, Lavender flippantly stated that her oldest sister said she would climb Geranio like a vine, which made him spit out the milk with laughter, which was also heard throughout Snow Square. Yet not all the tributes had survived the wave. Martella, from 10, had woken just seconds before the wave reached her, and while she was getting up and starting to run, she was quickly submerged and killed by the wave. Secondly, Luma, from 8, was approximately at the same level of the valley as Geranio and Lavender had previously been. He saw the wave at roughly the same time, but just as he started running up the hill, he sprained his ankle much worse than Lavender had, and he was no longer able to walk without immense pain. Luma therefore sat back down as the wave rolled up the valley towards him, and with a tear in his eye, he said he loved his family, before closing his eyes and singing to himself. Within a minute, the wave had killed him too. As Geranio and Lavender rested in the alcove, they looked down and saw the water gradually receding back into the ocean, and throughout the evening, the cornucopia and beach started to become visible again. Luckily for Geranio, he placed his knife in his pocket when he started running from the wave, but this meant that it was the only possession that the pair still had between them. For the rest of the day, Geranio tried to show Lavender how to use the knife, and her skills improved to some degree. Yet as dusk was setting, they were once again sent some soup by sponsors, which they ate as soon as it arrived. That night, the portraits of Luma from 8 and Martella from 10 were shown, which left 10 tributes remaining. The next day, Geranio awoke as the sun was rising, and they looked down the valley to see that the water had completely receded, and that the bottom of the valley was now back to how it had been prior to the wave. Geranio stood up for a better view, but he immediately threw himself back down to the ground when he saw the tributes from Districts 2 and 4 across the valley, walking down to the beach. Geranio landed on Lavender, and she instinctively hit him in the face, but he ignored this, and whispered that they needed to stay down so the other group would not see them. Once this group had passed far enough, Lavender stated that she was hungry and that she needed to eat, whilst Geranio admitted that he was starting to feel hungry as well. Lavender pointed out that most of the coconut trees had been destroyed by the wave, whilst Geranio mentioned that once the other group had caught some fish on the beach, they could try stealing them from this group, but Lavender was once again skeptical about this plan. After some discussion, the pair agreed to at least follow the group to the beach and see if there was anything that they could find there. They slowly made their way down the valley, whilst making sure that the crevices of the hills blocked them from the others' vision. Eventually, they made it back to the bottom of the valley, and they proceeded to hide behind some bushes just off the beach, within 100 meters of Ciro and Natalia's location. These two tributes appear to be having a private discussion, whilst Blue and Nasuta, both from 4, were using broken tree branches to skewer fish, which they laid on a nearby blanket on the sand. Geranio and Lavender continued to watch, and they quietly discussed how they could take these fish, of which the presence alone was making Lavender even more ravenous. Whilst they concluded that they should not act until sunset, they began to notice that the skies above the top of the valley had gone from the pleasant blue to a rather grim black. They proceeded to hear a few shouts and screams coming from the higher ground, along with what sounded like an intense croaking. The dark clouds proceeded to make their way down the valley towards the beach, and as the croaking intensified, all the tributes on the beach had by now noticed that frogs were starting to fall from above. As Lavender shouted at Geranio that they should move, a frog thudded down onto her head. She impulsively jumped up and seemed to worry that she had just given away their position to the group on the beach. But a cannon sounded at the same time, and the others on the beach were struggling to shelter from the amount of frogs that were falling on them. This group tried to gather their supplies, which were now covered by a growing number of frogs. But just as they started to pick up their weapons, a loud shout was heard from along the beach. Ciro and Natalia headed towards this sound, and they told Blue and Nasuta to guard their supplies. Yet as Ciro and Natalia ran towards the area where they had heard the sound, Nasuta looked up and a frog landed straight onto her eye. It had been Nevada, from 6, who had shouted in pain from the bottom of the valley when a frog landed on her foot. But as Ciro and Natalia ran through the hopping frogs to the bottom of the valley, Nevada saw them through the bushes and quickly placed herself back within the grass of the valley, where she had been camouflaged, and when Ciro and Natalia arrived in this area, they failed to spot Nevada, and they ran straight past her, which allowed her to escape up the valley to safety. Meanwhile on the beach, Nasuta's eye was bleeding from the impact of the falling frog, and she panicked as Blue tried to hold her still to look at her eye. But it was then that Lavender insisted that she and Geranio seize their opportunity. She proceeded to grab Geranio by the hand, and they ran through the raining frogs towards the fish that lay on the blanket behind Blue and Nasuta. Blue was still busy trying to tend to Nasuta, and when she shouted to him that Lavender and Geranio were taking the fish from behind him, it was too late. Lavender grabbed the blanket carrying the fish, as Geranio used his knife to warn them not to attack. Blue protested, but he was unarmed, and Ciro and Natalia were still hunting for Nevada. Eugenia stated that Geranio looked ready to kill Blue and Nasuta, but before he had a chance, Lavender insisted that they ran away before Ciro and Natalia returned, which they proceeded to do, and as they fled from the beach, the frogs gradually stopped falling from the skies. Once Geranio and Lavender had travelled a decent distance from the beach, they reached an alcove on the right side of the valley, where they set a base and ate some of the fish before resting. As it got dark, they discussed who was left and where they should head tomorrow, but whilst Geranio suggested heading to the top of the valley, another cannon sounded. It was revealed to viewers that Ciro had planted a knife in Blue's bag as he slept. When Blue awoke later, Ciro pretended to search for his knife, and when he told Blue to show him what was in his bag, he took out the knife and killed Blue there and then, claiming that he would not tolerate liars. That night, as Geranio and Lavender rested, they saw the portraits of Blue from 4 and John from 12, the latter of whom had run into the side of a mountain during the rainfall of frogs, before Dynamo from 1 stabbed him in the head, which killed him a short while later. The next morning, Lavender and Geranio were awoken by another cannon, and it was seen that Nasuta had escaped from the group on the beach during the night, but as she stopped in the bushes by the beach, Nevada had jumped out and tackled Nasuta to the ground, before slitting her throat with the jagged edge of a coconut shell. Nevada had then travelled up the valley as quickly as she could, whilst Nasuta lay bleeding to death, and so when the cannon sounded a few minutes later and the other tributes noticed the hovercraft, Nevada had already fled from the scene of the killing. Once Nasuta's cannon sounded, the other 7 tributes were awoken. Due to the falling frogs, it appeared that several coconuts had fallen from a tree that was close to Geranio and Lavender's alcove, and so they collected the milk in their bottles. Whilst they were doing this, they saw Cyril and Natalia walking up the other side of the valley. This time Lavender stated that they should follow Cyril and Natalia, which could allow them to kill this pair or find other tributes. Therefore Geranio and Lavender proceeded to follow them from the other side of the valley, whilst hiding between various hills. They continued following them for nearly an hour, until they were almost at the top of the valley, but the valley was narrowing as they reached the top. Unbeknownst to Geranio and Lavender, Natalia had noticed them out of the corner of her eye, and she mentioned their presence to Ciro. He and Natalia proceeded to head upwards for a few more minutes, before suddenly charging across the valley towards Geranio and Lavender. Lavender screamed as they approached, and she and Geranio sprinted away back down the valley, but she tripped and then bashed her head on a sharp rock. Geranio quickly tried to get Lavender up, but when he noticed that she was bleeding and unconscious, he panicked and narrowly avoided a knife that was thrown by Ciro, who was only a few seconds from their position. Geranio tried picking up Lavender onto his back, but as he lifted her, Ciro threw another knife and it hit Lavender in the back of the head, which made her splutter out blood from her mouth. Appearing to realize that there was no way that he could save her, and that she would not want him to die with her, Geranio quickly dropped Lavender, and he sprinted down the valley. Ciro tried to follow Geranio, and Natalia stabbed Lavender further, but when Ciro tripped on a rock and scraped his hand, he gave up on chasing Geranio and turned back to Natalia, just as Lavender's cannon sounded. Geranio fled further down the valley as he breathed in a panicked manner whilst hunting for somewhere to hide. Meanwhile, Natalia urged Ciro to chase after Geranio, who was almost out of sight. Ciro stated that he was too far away, but Natalia got up and ordered Ciro to chase Geranio whilst he could. She continued to shout at Ciro, but he turned round and took out another knife, before turning back round and throwing his knife straight at Natalia's brain. This sudden killing triggered some shocked gasps from Snow Square, but Eugenia subsequently claimed that she knew Ciro was going to do that. Donald agreed and said that it was around this time that the career tributes would begin to turn on each other. Within seconds, Natalia fell backwards and her cannon sounded. As the hovercraft collected the two bodies, Ciro carefully made his way down the valley in order to look for Geranio once more, but he appeared scared of being ambushed, and so he travelled slowly, which allowed Geranio to hide himself in a secluded mountain alcove halfway down the valley. He still seemed rather shell-shocked from what he had witnessed, and he ate some of the fish that he and Lavender had taken. He was also gifted with a final sponsor gift, which was revealed to be an extremely sharp knife. Attached was a note saying, "Live your life," from B. That night, the portraits of Natalia from 2, Nasuta from 4, and Lavender from 11 were shown in the sky, and Geranio put his hand over his heart when he saw Lavender's portrait. Eugenia and Donald then commented that there were only 5 tributes remaining. Eugenia stated that she thought Geranio would win, whilst Donald opted for Ciro, but said that he would not underestimate Nevada, seeing as she had been hiding, but had managed to kill other tributes, which was rare for a hider. Geranio appeared to have trouble sleeping that night, and continually jerked awake when he thought he heard a sound, but just as he started to fall asleep during the sunrise the next morning, another cannon was heard, which was revealed to be Titania's, after she had tried to stab Dynamo when she mistakenly thought he was sleeping, but he had moved at the last second and thrown a knife at Titania shortly afterwards. Geranio quickly woke up again from this cannon, and he appeared to be extremely deprived of sleep, but just as he was about to fall back to sleep, the tracker in his arm suddenly started beeping. Geranio jumped from this noise, and he now seemed to be fully awakened. He was left confused and seemed to think that it may have been an error, but his beeping then stopped, before he heard another alarm from further down the valley, which viewers saw had belonged to Dynamo. 10 seconds later this also stopped, and Nevada's tracker sounded for the same amount of time, before Ciro's did the same. Like the other tributes, Geranio was perplexed by what was happening, but when his tracker blared out again, he jumped once more and appeared to realise that this was Game Maker Paddock's way of ending the games. Geranio ran out from the alcove, and his tracker started making a sound again, before the sound seemed to transfer to the tracker of Dynamo, and within seconds the 4 remaining tributes appeared able to see each other. As Geranio ran down through the valley, he could see Ciro and Dynamo wrestling on the beach and trying to stab each other with their knives. Geranio then seemed to realise that he could try and kill them both whilst they were distracted. He therefore tried to run even faster, whilst clearly trying not to fall over. Unfortunately for Geranio, Ciro stabbed Dynamo just seconds later, but he nevertheless continued running towards Ciro. Nevada had kept her location a secret throughout the games, but was no longer able to do this due to the tracker alarms. As Dynamo's cannon sounded, Ciro spotted Nevada at the bottom of the valley and he chased after her. Being much taller than Nevada, Zero quickly ran after her and threw his knife, which hit her in the back and she fell to the floor. Although Nevada tried to take the knife out of her back in order to defend herself, this was clearly far too painful for her, and as her cries were heard amidst the beeping, Zero approached Nevada and thrust a knife through her neck, which then sounded her cannon. Yet just as Zero turned around to look for Geranio, the sound of the tracker alarm suddenly stopped. Zero looked very suspicious and appeared on guard as he looked through the bushes by the beach. He held both of his knives out at the ready, but just then Geranio threw his knife through the bushes and straight into Zero's stomach. Zero shouted and tried to take out the knife, but Geranio proceeded to charge towards him. Zero clutched his stomach as he threw a knife at Geranio's head, which he dodged. Zero then threw his other knife, but Geranio rolled forwards beneath the trajectory of the knife, and as he jumped back up, he thrust the knife further into Zero's stomach. This made Zero wince in pain, and he gradually collapsed. Geranio started to break down, and did not stop saying to Zero that he was sorry. He cried, and Zero's cannon sounded. Within a minute, Geranio Landry was announced to be the winner of the 77th Hunger Games, and he was consequently lifted from the arena by the hovercraft. During the victor's interview, Eugenia dressed in a dark, frog-themed catsuit, which proved to be popular with the audience. She spoke to Geranio about the games, and although he became quite emotional when she mentioned his kills or Lavender's death, he was able to share some jokes with Eugenia. At the end of the interview, she asked Geranio what he wanted to do with the rest of his life, and he paused for a few seconds before turning to her and replying that he would find out what made him happy. This response was slowly met with applause, and Eugenia grinned and stated that this was a good answer. After Geranio's victory tour, he spent several months living with Bluebell Jansen and her family. Despite allegedly suffering from occasional bouts of extreme darkness and worry, he used the support of Bluebell and her granddaughter Ivona in order to remind himself of the joys in his life. He eventually married Ivona, and they moved to a remote suburb of the capital, where it is known that they have had a daughter, but they have allegedly opted to keep her away from the stresses of the media, and so even her name is not known. So that was the 77th Games. Thank you very much for watching once again. I hope you enjoyed, and the 78th Games will be coming next Monday. Now, I've noticed in the comments, some people have been saying that they'd love to see this as a Netflix series. I absolutely would love that as well. I don't know how they would do it, but I'd love to see it. And I was thinking, if they made an 8-episode season, for example, I think it would be best to show a game from each decade, with the 8 decades that we've already gone through, just to show a bit of difference over time, show a variety of games. And I'm wondering, if you could choose one game from each decade, so one from games 1 to 10 back in the amphitheatre, one from games 11 to 20, etc., all the way up to a game from the 70s that we're currently in, what would you choose for each game, or each decade? Which 8 would you choose? Let me know in the pinned comment, and if you need, I'm also attaching the wiki list of all the winners so far, which might help. Anyway, until next time, I hope you all have a nice week, and see you soon.